The wind howled like a feral beast as the snowstorm intensified, consuming everything in a blinding curtain of white. Jack stumbled through the icy streets, his tattered coat offering little protection against the biting cold. His hands were numb, his breath came out in clouds, and his thoughts were clouded by despair. The city, usually bustling with life, now seemed like a frozen ghost town. He shivered violently, his boots barely keeping his feet from succumbing to frostbite. With every step, he scanned the desolate alleyways for shelter, his eyes darting to broken doors or heaps of trash that might provide some semblance of warmth. Time was running out. The storm wasn't just a force of nature. It was a predator, relentless and unforgiving. Jack wasn't sure how long he could hold out. His stomach growled in protest, a cruel reminder of the meals he hadn't had. Just as he prepared to collapse against a graffiti-covered wall, a faint noise cut through the howling wind. It wasn't the sound of metal rattling or snow crunching beneath heavy boots. It was softer, almost mournful, a whimper. He turned toward the sound, squinting through the driving snow. There, beneath a pile of discarded boxes, he saw a shape shift slightly. He hesitated. He could barely care for himself. What good would it do to investigate? But the sound persisted, fragile yet insistent, tugging at something deep inside him. Jack knelt and carefully pulled back one of the boxes. Beneath it lay a dog, thin and trembling, its fur matted with ice. Its amber eyes met his, wide with fear, but somehow hopeful. A German Shepherd mix, he guessed, though its malnourished frame made it hard to tell. Jack exhaled sharply, his breath visible in the freezing air. "Hey there," he murmured, his voice hoarse from days of silence. The dog flinched but didn't bolt. Instead, it let out another soft whine, as if pleading for help. Jack knew better than to make promises. He had none left to give. Still, he couldn't walk away. He slid his freezing hands under the dog's frail body and lifted it carefully. It was lighter than he'd expected, a sad testament to its struggles. Together, they trudged through the storm, Jack holding the dog close to his chest in an attempt to share what little warmth he had. His legs felt like lead, each step more difficult than the last. Eventually, he spotted a dilapidated building at the end of the alley. Its boarded-up windows and broken sign offered no guarantees, but it was shelter. He pushed open the rotting door with his shoulder, the hinges screeching in protest. Inside, the air was marginally warmer, though the building was in ruins. Broken furniture littered the space, and a faint draft hinted at holes in the walls. Jack found a corner where the wind was less severe and gently placed the dog on a piece of cardboard. "Guess we're stuck together now," he said with a weak smile. The dog blinked up at him, its ears twitching. Jack rummaged through his pockets, finding only a stale crust of bread. He broke it in half and offered a piece to the dog, who sniffed it cautiously before devouring it in a single gulp. The storm raged outside, but for the first time in days, Jack felt a flicker of warmth. He sat with his back against the wall, the dog curled against his side. The two shared the kind of silence that didn't need words, their breaths steadying as exhaustion overtook them. Jack didn't know the dog's name, but something about its resilience reminded him of the word buddy. As dawn approached, the fragile peace was shattered by a deep rumble. Jack's eyes snapped open as the ground beneath him trembled. Above, the ceiling groaned ominously. He scrambled to his feet, Buddy letting out a sharp bark as the first chunk of debris crashed to the floor. The building was collapsing. "Come on, Buddy," Jack shouted, grabbing the dog and rushing toward the exit. But their path was blocked by a pile of rubble. The air filled with dust and the acrid scent of mold. Buddy barked again, his sharp yips cutting through the chaos. To Jack's amazement, the dog began to dig furiously at the base of the debris, pawing at the wood and plaster as if his life, and Jack's, depended on it. Jack hesitated only a moment before joining in, clawing at the rubble with his bare hands. The cold bit into his skin, but adrenaline kept him moving. Together, man and dog worked tirelessly, creating a narrow passage. Jack pushed Buddy through first, then squeezed himself out just as the ceiling behind them gave way with a deafening crash. Outside, the storm had lessened, though the wind still cut like knives. Jack collapsed onto the icy ground, Buddy panting beside him. They had escaped, but just barely. Jack looked at the dog, his heart pounding. "You saved us," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. Buddy wagged his tail faintly, his eyes bright despite the ordeal. For the first time in a long while, Jack felt something other than despair. It wasn't just gratitude. It was hope, fragile but growing. He didn't know what lay ahead, but with Buddy by his side, he dared to believe they might find something better. The storm had passed, leaving the city blanketed in a deceptive calm. The snow glittered under the pale morning sun, but the biting cold remained unforgiving. Jack and Buddy trudged through the icy streets, their breath visible in the frosty air. Each step felt heavier than the last, but Jack was determined to keep moving. The ruins of the collapsed building behind them were a stark reminder of how close they'd come to disaster. Buddy walked slightly ahead, his nose to the ground as if tracking something unseen. Jack marveled at the dog's energy despite the ordeal they had just survived. He hadn't expected to feel such a connection with an animal, but Buddy's presence gave him a purpose he hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long while, Jack didn't feel entirely alone. The streets were eerily quiet. The usual hum of traffic and distant chatter was replaced by the crunch of snow underfoot. Most people had taken shelter from the harsh weather, leaving the city's forgotten corners to the likes of Jack and Buddy. As they rounded a corner, Buddy stopped abruptly, his ears perking up. Jack followed his gaze to a dumpster behind an abandoned diner. "What is it, boy?" Jack asked, his voice hoarse but curious. Buddy barked once, then trotted over to the dumpster. Jack sighed and followed. To his surprise, Buddy began sniffing around a discarded box of produce, pawing at it with urgency. Inside, Jack found a few half-frozen potatoes and a loaf of bread that was stale but edible. "Well, look at you," Jack said, shaking his head in disbelief. "You're better at this survival thing than I am." Buddy wagged his tail proudly, and Jack couldn't help but smile. It wasn't much, but it was something. They shared the bread as they continued their journey, the small meal giving Jack enough strength to push forward. As the hours passed, Jack began to open up, speaking aloud to Buddy as if the dog could understand him. He told Buddy about his past, a steady job in construction, a modest apartment, and a life that had once been stable, if unremarkable. But then came the accident. A fall from a scaffolding left him with a broken leg and mounting medical bills. When he couldn't work, he lost everything. It all just spiraled, Jack admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "I tried to bounce back, but every step forward came with 2 steps back. And now, here I am. Here we are." Buddy looked up at him with those intelligent amber eyes, and Jack felt a strange sense of comfort. It was as if Buddy was telling him that his story wasn't over yet. That night, they found shelter beneath an overpass. Jack arranged a makeshift bed from cardboard and an old blanket he had salvaged earlier in the day. Buddy curled up beside him, his body a welcome source of warmth against the freezing night. Jack stared up at the graffiti-covered concrete, his mind racing with thoughts of what might come next. Sleep came fitfully, and when Jack awoke, Buddy was gone. Panic gripped him as he scrambled to his feet, calling out for the dog. "Buddy, where are you?" His voice echoed through the empty streets, but there was no response. He searched frantically, his heart pounding in his chest. Buddy had been his lifeline, his only companion in this cold and unforgiving world. The thought of losing him was unbearable. After what felt like hours, Jack spotted a familiar silhouette in the distance. Buddy was standing near the entrance of an alleyway, his tail wagging excitedly. "Buddy," Jack called out, relief flooding his voice. But as he approached, he noticed something in the dog's mouth. It was a wallet, slightly weathered but clearly full of cash. Jack froze. He looked from the wallet to Buddy, then back again. "Where did you find that?" he asked, though he knew the dog couldn't answer. Buddy barked and dropped the wallet at Jack's feet. Jack picked it up hesitantly, his fingers trembling. Inside, there was at least a couple $100s in cash, along with an ID card and some credit cards. The name on the ID read, Peter Hargrove. Jack's mind raced. The money could buy them food, maybe even a place to stay for a few nights. But it wasn't his. And if someone as well off as Peter Hargrove had lost his wallet, he'd likely have the means to find it. Jack stared at Buddy, who tilted his head as if waiting for a decision. "What are you trying to tell me, boy?" Jack muttered. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had nothing, but taking what wasn't his didn't feel right. After a long moment, he made his choice. "Come on, Buddy," he said, slipping the wallet into his pocket. "Let's go find Peter Hargrove." Buddy wagged his tail and trotted ahead, leading Jack through the streets with a determination that seemed almost uncanny. As they navigated the city, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that Buddy knew exactly where they were going. The address on the ID led them to an upscale neighborhood on the edge of the city. The houses here were a far cry from the crumbling buildings and makeshift shelters Jack was used to. Buddy stopped in front of a large gate, barking once to announce their arrival. Jack hesitated before pressing the intercom button. A voice crackled through the speaker. "Yes? Who is it?" My name's Jack," he said, his voice unsteady. "I found a wallet that belongs to Peter Hargrove." There was a pause, and then the gate began to creak open. Jack stepped through cautiously, Buddy at his side. A woman in her late 60s emerged from the house, her expression a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "You found Peter's wallet?" she asked, her sharp eyes scanning Jack and Buddy. "Yes, ma'am," Jack said, pulling it from his pocket. "My dog found it, actually." The woman's gaze softened as she looked at Buddy. "Your dog, huh?" She knelt down, extending a hand toward Buddy, who sniffed it before giving her fingers a tentative lick. "Good boy," she murmured, scratching behind his ears. Then she stood and looked at Jack. "Peter's my grandson. He'll be relieved to have this back." Jack handed her the wallet, and she took it with a nod of gratitude. "Thank you," she said. "Most people wouldn't have gone to the trouble." Jack shrugged, unsure of how to respond. Before he could say anything, Buddy let out a low growl, his eyes fixed on something inside the house. The woman followed his gaze, her brow furrowing. "What is it, boy?" she asked, stepping toward the door. Buddy barked again, more insistently this time, and Jack felt a chill run down his spine. Something was off, and Buddy seemed determined to make them see it. Buddy's bark echoed in the grand entrance of the Hargrove estate, his ears pinned back and his body tense. Jack shifted uneasily, unsure of what had triggered Buddy's sudden alarm. The older woman, who had introduced herself as Margaret, looked down at the dog with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "What's gotten into him?" she asked, her voice tinged with unease. Buddy's focus didn't waver. He stood at the base of a grand staircase, his gaze fixed on an antique cabinet tucked into the corner. His growls were low and insistent, as if warning them of something unseen. Jack knelt beside the dog, placing a calming hand on his back. "I don't know," Jack said, his voice wary. "But he's usually right about this kind of thing." Margaret raised an eyebrow, but seemed to trust Buddy's instincts. She approached the cabinet cautiously, the hem of her elegant dress sweeping across the polished wood floor. When she reached it, she hesitated, her hand hovering over the brass handle. "Do you think there's something inside?" she asked. Jack exchanged a glance with Buddy, whose growling intensified. Taking that as confirmation, Jack stood and moved toward the cabinet. "Let me," he offered. Margaret stepped aside, her expression wary. Jack gripped the handle, his rough fingers trembling slightly as he pulled it open. The hinges creaked, revealing a hidden compartment behind the shelves. Inside were several thick folders and a small locked box. Margaret's face fell. "That's not supposed to be there," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Jack picked up one of the folders, flipping it open. Inside were documents with legal jargon he didn't fully understand, but the names and figures leaped out at him. Fraudulent financial transactions, offshore accounts, and payments that linked back to the Hargrove family name. This looks bad," Jack said, handing the folder to Margaret. Her hands shook as she skimmed the pages. "These are my son's dealings," she admitted, her voice filled with disbelief. "I always suspected he wasn't running the business ethically, but I never thought it was this calculated." Buddy barked again, his attention now shifting to the door leading to the basement. Jack frowned, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Whatever Buddy was sensing, it wasn't just about the documents. It was something more. Margaret gestured for them to follow as she led the way to the basement door. The stairs creaked under their weight as they descended into the dimly lit space. The basement smelled of damp concrete and old wood, and the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. Buddy's nose worked overtime, sniffing the ground as he led them deeper. "What else could be down here?" Margaret asked, her voice unsteady. "I don't know," Jack replied, "but Buddy's instincts haven't been wrong so far." They reached a large storage area filled with dusty furniture and forgotten heirlooms. In the far corner, a locked metal cabinet caught Buddy's attention. He barked sharply, his paws scratching at the door. Margaret frowned. "I don't recognize this," she said, pulling a set of keys from her pocket. After fumbling for a moment, she found the right one and unlocked the cabinet. Inside were more documents. This time, they included names of employees and partners who had been implicated in the fraudulent activities. There were also detailed blueprints and plans for an expansion that appeared to be built on stolen funds. Margaret sank onto a nearby stool, her face pale. This is worse than I imagined. My son. He's been covering all of this up. If this gets out, it'll ruin the family." Jack placed a hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes the truth needs to come out," he said gently. "Even if it's hard." Margaret looked at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You don't understand. This isn't just about him. My grandson, Peter. He's next in line to inherit everything. If this scandal breaks, it'll destroy his future." Buddy barked again, his interruption forcing them to focus. Jack sighed. "We'll deal with that later. Let's get these documents someplace safe." "They're evidence." Margaret nodded, and together they carried the files upstairs. Once everything was laid out on the dining room table, Margaret sat down heavily in one of the ornate chairs. Jack noticed her hands trembling as she poured herself a glass of water. "I don't know what to do," she admitted. "If I turn my son in, it could destroy Peter's life. But if I keep quiet, I'd be complicit." Jack frowned. He wasn't used to solving moral dilemmas, but he understood integrity. "I think you know the right thing to do," he said. "It's just a matter of having the courage to do it." Before Margaret could respond, the front door burst open, slamming against the wall. A man in an expensive suit stormed in, his face flushed with anger. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his eyes darting between the documents and Jack. "Michael," Margaret said, her voice icy. "We need to talk." Michael Hargrove, her son and Peter's father, glared at Jack. "Who is this?" he snapped. "What's he doing here?" Jack stood his ground, his shoulders squaring. "I'm the one who found your wallet. And your secrets." Michael's eyes darkened as he realized what Jack meant. "You've got no right to stick your nose in my business," he growled. Margaret rose to her feet, her composure returning. "Your business is our family's legacy," she said firmly, "and you've been using it to enrich yourself at the expense of others." "I won't allow it anymore," Michael sneered. "And what are you going to do about it? Hand me over to the police? Do you have any idea what that would do to Peter?" "I'll protect Peter," Margaret said, her voice resolute, "but I won't protect you from the consequences of your actions." As the argument escalated, Buddy barked loudly, standing between Jack and Michael as if sensing the growing tension. Jack placed a calming hand on Buddy's head, but his own nerves were on edge. He knew this confrontation wasn't over. "I'll give you one chance," Margaret said, her voice calm but firm. "Turn yourself in, or I'll do it for you." Michael's jaw tightened, his face a mask of fury. Without another word, he stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Margaret collapsed back into her chair, her shoulders shaking as she tried to hold back tears. Jack crouched beside her. "You did the right thing," he said softly. "It's not easy, but it's the right thing." Margaret looked at him, her expression one of gratitude and exhaustion. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Buddy wagged his tail, the tension in the room slowly dissipating. Jack scratched behind his ears, a small smile tugging at his lips. They weren't out of the woods yet, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like they were heading in the right direction. The house fell silent after Michael's stormy departure, but the tension lingered like a ghost in the ornate halls. Jack sat at the dining room table, his rough hands resting on the piles of incriminating documents. Buddy lay at his feet, his tail flicking back and forth as if he, too, could sense the unease in the air. Across from him, Margaret was lost in thought, her hands clasped tightly around a steaming cup of tea. "What happens now?" Jack finally asked, his voice low. He wasn't sure why he cared so much. This wasn't his family, and these weren't his problems. Yet something about Margaret's quiet resolve and the way Buddy had led him to this moment made him feel invested. Margaret sighed, her gaze distant. "I'll have to contact the authorities," she said, her voice steady but tinged with sorrow. "Michael will fight this, of course. He'll try to spin it, maybe even pin it on someone else. But I have to believe the truth will prevail." Jack nodded, though he could see the weight of that decision pressing down on her. "You're doing the right thing," he said. Margaret managed a faint smile. "So are you, Jack. If it weren't for you and Buddy, I never would have uncovered this. I owe you more than I can say." Buddy perked up at the sound of his name, his ears twitching as he sat up. Margaret chuckled softly, leaning down to scratch behind his ears. "You're quite the hero, aren't you?" The sound of footsteps on the staircase drew their attention. Peter, Margaret's teenage grandson, appeared at the bottom step, his face pale with confusion. "Grandma? What's going on?" he asked, his voice wary. Margaret hesitated, then gestured for him to join them at the table. "Peter, we need to talk," she said gently. Jack stood, sensing that this was a family conversation. "I'll give you some space," he said, motioning to Buddy. The dog trotted after him as they stepped out onto the front porch. The cold air hit Jack's face, sharp but refreshing. He leaned against the railing, his breath visible in the crisp night. Buddy sat beside him, his eyes scanning the quiet street. Jack scratched the dog's head absently, his mind racing. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, from freezing on the streets to finding an unexpected ally in Buddy and a purpose in helping Margaret. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, it felt like he had options. The sound of the door opening behind him broke his reverie. Margaret stepped out, wrapping a shawl tightly around her shoulders. "Peter's taking it as well as can be expected," she said, her voice soft. "He's angry, of course, and hurt, but he understands why this has to be done." Jack nodded. "Kids are resilient," he said. "He'll get through it." Margaret gave him a thoughtful look. "What about you, Jack? What are you going to do now?" The question caught him off guard. He'd spent so long just surviving that he hadn't allowed himself to dream of something more. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I think I'd like to try and rebuild. Find work, maybe a place to stay. Something steady." Margaret smiled. "You've got a good heart. I think you'll do just fine." Before Jack could respond, the rumble of an engine drew their attention. A sleek black car pulled into the driveway, its headlights slicing through the darkness. Jack's shoulders tensed as Michael stepped out, his expression hard and unreadable. "What are you doing here?" Margaret asked, her voice cold. Michael raised his hands in mock surrender. "Relax, Mother. I'm not here to cause trouble. I came to talk." Margaret folded her arms, her gaze steely. "You've done enough talking for one night." Michael ignored the jab, his eyes flicking to Jack and Buddy. "You," he said, pointing at Jack. "You think you've saved the day, don't you? Coming in here with your scruffy dog and your sob story." Jack clenched his jaw but said nothing. Buddy growled softly, stepping closer to Jack as if to shield him. "You have no idea what you've set in motion," Michael continued. "The fallout from this, it won't just affect me. It'll ruin this family." Margaret's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "The only person ruining this family is you, Michael. You lied, cheated, and stole, and now you're trying to blame everyone else for your choices." Michael glared at her, but before he could respond, Buddy barked sharply, startling them all. The dog's hackles were raised, his eyes locked on Michael with an intensity that made Jack step protectively in front of Margaret. "Leave," Jack said, his voice firm. "Whatever you're here to say, it doesn't matter. You've made your choices. Now it's time to face the consequences." For a moment, it looked like Michael might argue, but something in Jack's tone, or perhaps Buddy's unwavering stance, made him think twice. With a muttered curse, he got back into his car and sped away, the taillights disappearing into the night. Margaret let out a shaky breath, her composure slipping for just a moment. "Thank you," she said softly, "for standing up to him." Jack shrugged. "It wasn't just me," he said, glancing at Buddy. "He's got a way of making people listen." Margaret smiled. Her eyes warmed despite the tension of the evening. "He's a special dog," she said. "And you're a special man, Jack. Don't sell yourself short." The next morning dawned bright and clear, the storm having left the world clean and quiet. Margaret made good on her promise to contact the authorities, and Jack watched from the sidelines as the wheels of justice began to turn. By the time the house was quiet again, Margaret approached Jack with an envelope in hand. "This is for you," she said, pressing it into his hand. Inside was a small stack of cash and a handwritten note. Jack frowned. "I can't take this," he said. "Yes, you can," Margaret replied firmly. "Think of it as a thank you. For what you did, for me, for Peter, and even for Buddy. Use it to get back on your feet." Jack hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Margaret smiled. "You've earned it." As Jack and Buddy walked away from the estate, the sun shining down on them, Jack felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. He didn't know exactly where they were going, but he knew one thing for certain: they weren't just surviving anymore. They were starting over.